Do you even realize what you've done? My voice was steel, my grip white-knuckled on the edge of the kitchen table. Nora flinched, wrapping her arms around herself like it would stop what was coming. It wouldn't. I'd seen men break under interrogation, watch them shift from defiance to regret to begging. Nora wasn't there yet. She was still in the excuses phase. Dean, she hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean it. I let out a sharp breath, cutting her off. Don't insult me with that. 30 years in the army, most of it spent in strategy and intelligence. I'd pulled men out of ambushes, dismantled threats before they had a chance to materialize. I knew how to spot patterns, inconsistencies, the things people didn't say. And I sure as hell knew when I was being lied to. She dropped her gaze to the floor, shifting from one foot to the other. The kitchen clock ticked behind her, an old relic from when we still cared about decorating this house. A house I'd built for my family. A house she'd turned into something ugly. His name's Mark. The words came from behind me. I turned. Danny stood in the doorway, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pocket, his eyes avoiding mine. Nora's younger brother, late 20s, softer than I ever was at that age. Too much hesitancy in his voice, too much guilt. He already knew I knew. He just didn't know how much. He owns the tattoo place off Lincoln, Danny continued, his voice barely holding steady. Been seeing him a while, I think. A while. Not a mistake. Not a moment of weakness. This was deliberate. I turned back to Nora. How long? She swallowed, her jaw tightening. It's not a. How? Long. Her lips trembled before she pressed them into a thin line. I could see the calculations behind her eyes, trying to figure out what version of the truth would hurt the least. She didn't realize it didn't matter anymore. 6 months. 6 months. I let the number settle, watching the way she held herself. No tears. Just exhaustion. That part one understood. She'd been tired for years, stretched thin between raising the kids and keeping this house running. But I'd been tired too. Difference was I hadn't gone looking for comfort in someone else's arms. Danny shifted uncomfortably. Look, man, I didn't know if I should. I turned to him. Why didn't you tell me? His mouth opened, then closed. He scratched the back of his neck, avoiding my stare. She's my sister. And I'm your brother-in-law. A man you've known your whole damn life. He flinched. It wasn't my place. I let out a low, humorless chuckle. Not your place? Not your place was keeping quiet while she crawled into bed with some lowlife. Nora flinched at that, but I didn't care. Danny shook his head, voice cracking just a little. I didn't want to blow up your whole life. I stared at him for a long second, then at Nora. My life had already been blown up. The only thing left was deciding how much damage I was going to inflict in return. Nora spoke again, voice small. Dean, please? No, I pushed off the table and stepped back. I gave you everything. And this, I gestured between us, the space where our marriage used to be, this is what you did with it. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't need to. Real power, real control, didn't come from outbursts. It came from knowing exactly how to dismantle something, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. And right now, Nora was about to learn exactly what that felt like. I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, and into the cold night air. The street was quiet, porch lights glowing behind curtained windows. Normal people living their normal lives. People who weren't standing on their front lawns, trying to keep their world from collapsing. I leaned against my truck, hands on my hips, breathing deep to keep the anger from turning into something reckless. I needed control. I needed a plan. 6 months. Not a mistake. Not a moment of weakness. A decision made over and over again. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over my contacts. I had options. A lot of them. But I needed intel first. I never moved without knowing the terrain. The tattoo shop off Lincoln. I could already picture it. One of those grungy little places that smelled like antiseptic and regret. I'd passed it a dozen times without a second thought. Now it was a battlefield. I didn't know Mark Lasky, but I knew his type. A man who thought rules didn't apply to him. Who saw a tired woman and thought that made her available. Who got off on being the escape. The fantasy. The thing about fantasies? They shatter real easy. I made the call. Yeah? The voice on the other end was sharp, no patience for small talk. Reyes? Need a favor. A beat of silence, then a chuckle. This about your wife? News traveled fast. It's about the guy. Another pause. What do you need? Everything. By morning I had a file. Mark Lasky. 38. Divorced. No kids. Shop barely scraping by. A couple of minor charges in his past, bar fights, disorderly conduct, nothing serious. But there was something else. Something that made me sit back in my chair and exhale through my nose. The shop was behind on rent. Way behind. I made another call. Landlords didn't care about much, but they cared about money. A little push, a little incentive, and suddenly Mark had a problem. A big one. I closed the file and sat back, staring at the wall. This wasn't enough. Not yet. Men like him didn't just need to be removed, they needed to be erased. I didn't want Nora running back to him, thinking he was some tragic figure, a man destroyed by my wrath. No, I needed him to self-destruct. And I knew exactly how to make that happen. The first hit came fast. A random inspection from the health department. Someone had reported unsanitary conditions. The shop had to close for a full week. The second hit was financial. Customers started canceling. A few well-placed words to the right people and suddenly Mark's reputation wasn't just damaged, it was radioactive. Then came the landlord's notice. He had 30 days to vacate. I drove by the shop one night, watching from across the street. Mark was out front, cigarette in hand, pacing. He looked rough. Unshaven, shoulders hunched like the weight of it all was finally settling on him. Good. I could have left it at that. Could have let him spiral on his own. But I wasn't done. I still had one more move to make. Nora wasn't home when I got back. I wasn't surprised. She'd been gone a lot lately. Probably with him, trying to figure out why his world was crumbling. Let her. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd confronted her, and waited. The clock ticked. The house creaked. A lifetime ago, this place had felt like home. When she finally walked in, her shoulders were slumped, her eyes rimmed red. She stopped when she saw me. Dina. I held up a hand. Sit down. She hesitated, then obeyed. I studied her for a long moment. The woman I'd married was still in there somewhere, buried under years of exhaustion and resentment. But I wasn't here to dig her out. I know about the shop, I said. She blinked, caught off guard. What? I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. Mark. His money problems. His business collapsing. That's me. Her breath hitched. Dina. He's got nothing left. No shop. No customers. No future. You still want him. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting together. That's what I thought. Silence stretched between us. Then finally she spoke. What happens now? I stood, grabbing my keys. That's up to you. And with that I walked out, leaving her in the ruins of what she'd built. I drove. No destination, just pavement and time. The town was quiet at this hour, the streetlights flickering in the chill of the early morning. I let the engine hum beneath me, let my mind work through the pieces. The first phase was done, Mark was drowning. But I wasn't finished. Not until I was sure he couldn't claw his way back up. I pulled into a diner off the main road, one of those places that smelled like burnt coffee and fried grease no matter the time of day. A couple of truckers sat at the counter, nodding at me as I took a booth near the window. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, poured me a coffee without asking. Morning, Dean, she said, leaning against the booth. Haven't seen you in here this early in a while. Busy night? I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat sink in. She smirked. That kind of busy, or the other kind? I glanced up at her. The other kind. She nodded, wiping at the table with a rag that had seen better days. Thought so. You got that look? I didn't ask what look. I let my coffee sit untouched, staring out at the empty street. Mark had lost his shop. That was good. But it wasn't enough. He needed to lose Nora, too. Needed her to look at him and see nothing but wreckage. I pulled out my phone and sent a text. Short. Direct. Meet me at the lot. 1 hour. The response came quick. On my way. I dropped a 20 on the table and walked out. The lot was an old, abandoned gas station on the edge of town. A relic from another time left to rot. The pavement was cracked, weeds pushing through the cement. A single flickering streetlight buzzed overhead. Reyes was already there, leaning against his truck, smoking. He flicked the cigarette away as I approached. You look like hell, he said. Long night. He nodded, shifting his stance. So, what are we doing here? I pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. Reyes scanned it, eyebrows raising. Damn. He looked up at me. You serious? I didn't answer. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. All right. Your call. You sure you want to go this far? He's got nothing left. He's desperate. And desperate men do stupid things. Exactly. Reyes studied me for a long second. All right. I can make the call. I nodded. Make it happen. He tucked the paper into his pocket. You gonna tell me why? I glanced past him, out toward the dark horizon. Because when people fall, they should stay down. Reyes let out a low whistle. Cold, man. Real cold. I didn't respond. I just turned and walked back to my truck. It was time to finish this. The call went through that afternoon. Reyes didn't waste time, and neither did the guy on the other end. A man like Mark Lasky, struggling business, overdue rent, no safety net, he'd made deals. Bad ones. And bad deals had a way of catching up. I spent the next couple of days watching it unfold. Not directly. That wasn't how this worked. But I heard things. The shop had been on its last legs for a while, but once the wrong people found out about Mark's financial troubles, the pressure turned from bad to worse. He owed money, more than I expected, to the kinds of people who didn't take, "I'll get it to you next week," as an answer. And when a man like that starts slipping, he makes mistakes. I sat in my truck outside the VFW, listening to the rain tap against the windshield. My coffee had gone cold, but I wasn't in a hurry to move. Nora had been quiet. I knew she was still seeing him, but things had changed. She was tense, distracted, like she knew something was wrong but couldn't put her finger on it. She would soon enough. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Reyes. Yeah. Your boy's in trouble. I rubbed my jaw, watching the headlights of a passing car cut through the rain. How bad? He got his ass handed to him outside a bar last night. Word is, he was trying to scrape together cash. Borrowed from the wrong guy, couldn't pay it back. I leaned back against the headrest. And they gave him a warning. Next time, it won't just be his ribs. I closed my eyes for a moment. This was the part one liked best. The moment when the world shifted beneath a man's feet, when he realized he wasn't untouchable. You want me to pull back? Reyes asked. No. Didn't think so. He paused. Nora's gonna notice. She already has. And I thought about the way she'd been moving through the house, quieter than usual. The way she hesitated before answering the phone. The way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. She's starting to regret, I said. Reyes let out a low whistle. Cold, man. I didn't answer. 2 days later, it all came to a head. I was in my office, finishing up a report for a client, when Nora's car tore into the driveway. I watched from the window as she climbed out, slammed the door, and ran inside. I took my time following her in. She was pacing the living room, hands in her hair, breath coming fast. When she saw me, her eyes went sharp. You did this. I leaned against the doorframe. Did what? Don't play with me, Dean. She was shaking now, but it wasn't fear. It was anger. His shop is gone. His car was repossessed. She cut herself off, pressing a hand to her forehead. Jesus, Dean. They came after him. They beat him. I said nothing. Her voice cracked. This is you. I know it is. I stepped closer, slow, deliberate. You think I did this? She blinked hard, like she was trying to see me clearly for the first time. I don't know anymore. I let that sit between us. She shook her head. You didn't have to ruin him. I tilted my head. Didn't I? Silence. Then softer, almost to herself, she said, I thought you didn't care. I let out a short, humorless laugh. That was your mistake. She looked up at me then, and I saw it, the moment she realized she'd never really known me at all. I walked past her, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. Where are you going? She asked. I didn't look back. To watch him fall. The next day I made the call. It wasn't a threat or a warning. It was a promise. Mark Lasky was done. I showed up at the VFW later that evening. The place quiet except for the steady hum of the jukebox in the corner. A few veterans sat at the bar, nursing their beers, keeping to themselves. I didn't need any of them to see me, but I didn't care if they did. My reputation was one thing, but it was about to become something else entirely. Reyes was already there, leaning against the wall with a beer in hand, watching the door. He spotted me as soon as I walked in and gave me a slow nod. You're sure about this? He asked, not needing to raise his voice over the noise. I've been sure from the start. My eyes were already on the door, the weight of the decision sitting like concrete in my gut. I wasn't here to settle things with Mark. I was here to finish it. He's been nothing but trouble from the start. Reyes took a swig of his beer. The man's a mess, Dean. You really sure about crossing that line? I'm sure. I walked past him and toward the back exit. The darkness outside welcomed me, but I wasn't alone. Reyes fell into step beside me. Where we going? You'll see. I didn't look at him. Didn't need to. He was a good man, just like the rest of them in this town, but this was mine. And I wasn't about to share it. The lot across the street from Mark's shop was empty, save for a few rusted-out cars that had been left to rot. I had made sure he was here. I checked. Nothing left for him but this, whatever the hell this was going to be. I didn't feel any satisfaction. Not yet. Not until the job was done. Reyes followed my gaze as I stood under the flickering streetlight, watching the shop, waiting. He'll be here soon, he said, voice barely audible. You want me to step in, or? No. My voice was firm. This one's mine. I wasn't playing games. This wasn't a power play. It wasn't about sending a message. It was about control. The sound of a door opening broke the silence. I turned just in time to see Mark step into the alleyway, stumbling slightly as he made his way toward his car. He was wearing a leather jacket, the same one I'd seen him in a few times before, like he was still trying to look the part. The part of a man who had a future, who had power. The truth? The guy was hollow. And I was about to remind him. Mark. I called out. He froze, then turned slowly like he was expecting trouble but didn't know exactly where it was coming from. Dean, his voice was rough, like he hadn't had a decent night's sleep in weeks. What the hell do you want? I walked toward him, slow, deliberate. I want you to stop pretending you're something you're not. His eyes shifted, his posture stiffened. You got your revenge, all right? You can walk away now. I didn't stop. Revenge? This isn't about revenge, Mark. This is about survival. And you? You're not surviving. He looked like he might say something, but then he just scoffed, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and frustration. You're not gonna get away with this. I stopped in front of him, close enough that he could smell the whiskey on my breath. You're already gone. You just haven't figured it out yet. He clenched his fists, his jaw tight. You think you're untouchable? You think you can just make me disappear? I stood there, watching him, feeling the weight of his words but knowing they didn't matter. He was already done. His choices had already been made, and this was the end of the line for him. The pressure had mounted too much, the cracks were too wide. I turned away, heading back toward the street. You've already been erased, Mark. No one's going to remember your name. I heard him curse behind me, but I didn't look back. This wasn't a victory, it wasn't about me at all. It was about making sure someone paid for their mistakes. And he had. Now I could go home. But as I reached the end of the lot, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car door opening. And I didn't have to turn around to know that Mark wasn't going to let it end like this. He had too much pride. Too much desperation. And that was where he was going to slip up. I didn't look back when I heard the engine start, but I felt it, the pulse of danger, the rush of blood in my ears. He was coming. I'd known he would, but it didn't matter. The move had been made. It was only a matter of time before he realized how far out of his depth he was. I kept walking, slowly, giving him time to catch up, time to think about it. He wasn't thinking straight anymore. The desperation had kicked in. Mark was one of those types, the kind that always believed he could muscle his way out of anything, right up until they were backed into a corner. The headlights hit me from behind, and I knew the moment he'd floored it. The screech of tires told me everything I needed to know. I didn't bother turning around. I could feel the car closing in, feel the weight of it on my back, the decision in his hands whether to swerve or take me down. Mark! I shouted loud enough for him to hear me over the engine. Is this really how you want this to go? You're about to lose everything, and you're gonna throw the last of it away for a last-ditch shot at me. The car came closer, its engine growling like a predator, but I could tell he wasn't sure. His foot was still heavy on the gas, but his hands, those were shaking. I didn't have to look to know what he was thinking. The car veered right, swinging wide, tires screeching against the wet asphalt as it headed straight for me. He wanted to finish this. It was all he had left. But it was a mistake. At the last possible second, I shifted my weight, stepping to the side and letting the car's momentum push it right past me. I wasn't in a hurry to get out of the way. Let him see the fear he was hoping for but never got. Let him get close enough to understand the mistake he'd made. The car slammed into the side of a dumpster, the sound sharp and metallic, the impact echoing through the alley. I didn't flinch. I stood there, watching him struggle to get out of the car, his hands shaking as he tried to pull himself together. You done? I asked, calm as ever. He wasn't even close to done. Mark wasn't the type to give up. He was a man who clung to his pride even when everything around him was falling apart. He staggered out of the car, eyes wild, mouth working to form words that wouldn't come. His breathing was ragged, his clothes a mess, and he looked like he didn't know which direction was up. But it wasn't the fear in his eyes that caught me, it was the desperation. "You think this is over?" he gasped, wiping blood from his lip. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to take everything." I didn't say anything at first. I just watched him. He didn't get it. He didn't understand the game I was playing. To him, it was still about pride. But it was always about power. And I had all of it. "Mark," I finally said, my voice steady, "you never had a chance. You were always going to lose." He stepped forward, still trying to look tough, but I could see his shoulders slumping. The fight was already gone from him. It was clear in the way he moved, in the way his hands twitched at his sides. I turned on my heel and walked back toward the street, not giving him another glance. He didn't matter anymore. He was a casualty of a game he didn't understand, and it was time to wrap it up. There was no need to say goodbye to a man who'd never existed in the first place. The next few days were quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in after a storm, when everything is left in pieces but no one talks about it. Mark didn't make any more noise. He disappeared. No more calls, no more late-night visits. He was done. Nora, on the other hand, wasn't. She'd spent days in the house, not knowing what to do, knowing she couldn't go back to him but not sure where to go next. I gave her that space. She had to make the choice. She always had. The final act came without warning. She packed a bag. Left. I didn't stop her. I didn't try to talk her out of it. She was too far gone, too wrapped up in the chaos of her own choices to see the truth. And the truth was, she didn't belong in my world anymore. Not the way she was. She had a chance to walk away with dignity, but she'd already burned that bridge. I didn't feel the sting when she left. I felt something else, something cold, like relief. It was over. And I had moved on. A few weeks passed before I saw any of them again, Nora, Mark, or anyone from the old life I'd left behind. By then, things had settled. My work had picked up and the veterans group was thriving. The weight I'd been carrying had shifted, and it was like stepping out from under a long shadow into something that felt like I could breathe again. One evening, I was standing in front of the VFW hall, just finishing up a conversation with a few old buddies, when I saw her. Nora. She was standing across the street, watching me. Her eyes were tired, like they always were, but now there was something different. Maybe it was the emptiness I saw there, or maybe it was the realization that she'd made her choice too late. I didn't move. I didn't even acknowledge her. There was no point. The past was the past. The life we built was just that, built, and it had crumbled under the weight of her decisions. She crossed the street, her steps hesitant, unsure of what she was doing. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching her. "Dean." Her voice was barely above a whisper, almost like she wasn't sure I would hear her. "Can we talk?" I looked at her for a long moment, just taking her in. The way her clothes hung loose around her. The way she tried to hold herself up, but the cracks were visible. She wasn't the same woman I had once stood beside. Not in the way that mattered. "What's left to say?" I finally asked, my voice flat. She flinched but didn't back down. "I'm sorry." She stopped herself, looking down for a second. Then she looked back up at me, her eyes brimming with something like regret. "I didn't mean for it to end like this." I didn't flinch. Didn't soften. I just shook my head, almost disappointed that she was still trying to fix it. Fixing wasn't possible anymore. Not with words. Not with apologies. "Nora, whatever this was," I said, gesturing between us, "it's over. I'm done. You're done." Her eyes flickered with the familiar pain. But this time it was different. It was the kind of pain a person feels when they know they've lost everything and there's no coming back. No fixing. No way to rewrite the story. "You were never the man I needed you to be," she said quietly, her voice trembling. I thought I could make a life without you." I let her words hang in the air. There was no response that would change anything. There was no explanation that would fix the cracks in the foundation of what we used to have. "You can go," I said, taking a step back. "But understand one thing, this isn't about me anymore. You did this. I'm not here to fix your mess." Her lips parted as though she was going to say something else, but the words never came. She just nodded, her eyes shadowed with defeat. I didn't watch her walk away. I didn't need to. It was a month later when I saw Mark again. He had crawled out from whatever hole he'd been hiding in, but it was clear his life wasn't looking up. He was out front of his old tattoo shop, leaning against the wall, hands shoved into his pockets like he was trying to hide the rest of his pride. I pulled my truck over, parking just a few feet away, and stepped out slowly. He didn't see me at first. His back was to me as he fiddled with a pack of cigarettes, but when he heard my boots crunching on the gravel, he stiffened and turned. "Dean." His voice was rough, hoarse, like he hadn't used it much lately. What the hell do you want now? I walked toward him, slow, deliberate. The night was cold, but I didn't feel it. This moment, the final one, it was about control. It was about making sure there was no question left unanswered. You should have stayed down, I said, voice low, almost conversational. His eyes narrowed, but there was something in them, fear, maybe. Or maybe just the last shreds of the pride that had gotten him this far. You think this is over? He spat the words out like he was still trying to convince himself. You think you won? I smiled, cold, knowing. I already won. You just didn't know it yet. He took a step back like he was about to say something else, but he didn't. Instead, he just let his shoulders slump, defeated. He looked smaller. Pathetic. You've lost everything, Mark, I said, watching him sink into the reality of it. And now you're nothing. You were never going to be anything more than a distraction. He said nothing, just turned and walked away. A week later, I got the call. It was from the investigator, the one who'd been tailing me at the VFW event a few weeks back. Apparently, Mark's financial troubles were deeper than I'd thought. The guy had been mixed up with some illegal dealings, and now they were looking to see if I had anything to do with it. They weren't going to get anything. I hadn't touched a damn thing. I'd orchestrated it all without leaving a trace. But they didn't know that. And it didn't matter. I never picked up the phone. I never gave them the satisfaction. A year later, the town had moved on. Nora was gone. Mark was forgotten. No one talked about them anymore, and I had kept my distance. My business was thriving. I had respect. People knew my name, but they didn't know me. And that's the way I liked it. The veterans kept me grounded, reminded me that there were still men out there who understood what it meant to keep fighting. To stand tall. To survive. And every time I looked back on it, I felt the same cold satisfaction. It wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure they never got to play the game again. I'd survived. And that was enough.